Good afternoon, everybody. I am Stacy Gordon Sterling, the director of the Animal Legal Defense Fund Animal Law Program. It is my privilege to welcome you to the Climate Anxiety and Compassion Fatigue session. Thank you very much for joining us today. Before we get started, I want to thank our silver sponsor, Tofurky. This session will include a pre-recorded presentation followed by a live Q&A with Emma Maris. And now I get to introduce our presenter, Emma Maris. Emma Maris is a nonfiction writer whose work focuses on modern environmentalism. Her work appears in outlets including National Geographic, Outside, The Atavist, Wired, High Country News, and the New York Times. Her book, Rambunctious Gardens, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World, focuses on conservation approaches that don't focus on pristine wilderness. Maris is also a climate justice activist who emphasizes collective action on climate over reducing one's individual carbon footprint through consumer choices. She's a board member of the climate justice group Rogue Climate and an institute fellow at UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. She lives in Klamath Falls, Oregon. And I only read a part of her introduction, so if you go to the network button, you can read more about her work. And with that, we will begin the presentation.
All right, well, thanks so much. And I am really excited to virtually be here. I was so looking forward to meeting so many of you, and I hope that we can connect online. I'm going to talk a little bit about dealing with climate change hanging over our heads every day, all day. And I'm an environmental journalist, and I write about climate change for a living, so I know a little bit about this topic. It's a lot, and this particular summer has been a lot. This is where I live in Oregon. I live in a little town called Klamath Falls. It's just east of the mountains. And it's a really beautiful place with big skies and mountains. And I love it here. This summer, in fact, while we're recording this particular talk, this is what Oregon looks like. We've had just unbelievable wildfires that have just ripped through the state, especially up and down the I-5 corridor there. And these fires are clearly linked to climate change. So there's a lot of factors that go into a forest fire, but one of them is how dry and hot is your fuel. And the entire state of Oregon has been drier and hotter than ever because of climate change. So it's really tough. I mean, I'm sitting in this smoke that is the direct result of decades of decisions that were made by governments, big business, politicians, and it's extremely frustrating. So how do we cope with that? How do we deal with the anxiety and the guilt? How do we deal with all of those emotions? I just want to add here that I am going to talk a lot about working collectively in this talk and joining a group and the strength of that for many people. And the group that I work with is called Rogue Climate. It's in the Rogue Valley in Oregon. And it's a sort of a scrappy little climate justice organization. On one side of your screen there, you can see our board and staff photo that we took recently. And on the other side of the screen, you can see what the office looks like now after the fire burned it down. So this sense of having climate change be a real thing in your life is something that I'm feeling very strongly right now. In general, I'll just add that everybody at the board, all the volunteers, all the staff are safe. Some people did lose their homes, but everybody's safe and the rebuilding is already beginning. Of course, these climate change wildfires don't just burn down people's houses, they burn down animals' houses as well. This is a little cat named Chestnut that was in the recent fires here in Oregon and is now at the vet getting patched up. One of many pets. And of course, I think a lot about the wild animals as well, the deer, the birds. I found a dead bat in my yard the other day that I think was a casualty of the intense smoke that we have. So just being surrounded by all of that suffering and knowing that it was avoidable is a huge emotional weight to bear. Climate anxiety is a real thing. I like this quote from Jamie Margolin, who's a young climate activist. She also has been very open about having anxiety and OCD. And there was a time in her life where the climate situation was causing her sort of paralyzing dread. And I think she's not alone in this. I think that she's maybe more willing to talk about it than some of us older folks. But this is a pretty common way to feel. I also really like what she has to say about what has helped her. And what's really helped her, and what I think really helps a lot of people, is doing something, this action. And this quote where she says her mental and physical health have gotten better because she's busy responding to emails, being on conference calls, organizing marches, doing interviews. That really speaks to one of the ways in which this action works. Part of it is the sense that you're doing something, but part of it is also just keeping busy and keeping yourself filled with activities so that your time for rumination is less. It's I always think about when someone dies, there's a funeral and there's funeral preparations. And I honestly think that the reason that there are funerals is so that people who are grieving have to plan something, because those logistics are so helpful when you are going through that intense emotion. Now, I want to also pause and say that for people who are really struggling with the kind of magnitude of this and are really having a lot of problems, actual therapy beyond, doing this kind of action could be something that you should really look into. And there's no shame in needing to see a specialist or get help if climate change is oppressing you to the point where it's interfering with your life. You have to take care of yourself first. You have to take care of yourself both by seeking professional help, but also just the basics, get enough rest, hydrate, exercise, all those things. I think a lot of us sometimes feel like we have to be helping or working to make the world a better place 24/7. And that gets us into a trap where we're much more likely to burn out or become less effective over time because we're so afraid. And we really do need to take that time to make sure that we're in good shape so that we can do this work. So you shouldn't feel guilty if you need to rest. So I want to go back to 2006. And in 2006, I was working as a staff writer for the journal Nature, a scientific journal. And I remember it was when An Inconvenient Truth came out. And another thing that happened that year was this special issue of Vanity Fair. And I have this really clear memory of us all sitting around a staff meeting with this issue and having this conversation about whether this was going to be the pivot point, whether 2006 was going to be the year that we finally started caring about the climate and that policies started finally being adequate. We were very hopeful at that moment, and it wasn't as it didn't become the moment that we wanted it to be. So I've lived through a lot of these potential pivot moments. But having said that, I do feel like we are potentially at another one of those pivot moments. We have Greta Thunberg and we have her Fridays for Future movement. We had that huge climate strike last September, which was millions of people came out around the world. And then we've had these horrible events like the wildfires here in the West. And I am very hopeful that this will be another turning point, but this one will stick. And I feel like there is a difference between 2006 and 2020. And it is that the solutions that we're talking about are actually commensurate to the problem. So back in 2006, a lot of people went to go see An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's documentary about the climate crisis. And it was this kind of panoply of disaster and science explaining how terrible things could get, pictures of people struggling in hurricanes and fires. And then at the end, when it was time for sort of what can you do, really what Al Gore offered us was light bulbs. He really kind of pushed this sort of, you can help by changing your light bulbs to low energy light bulbs and other sort of individualistic fixes. This has been the sort of the predominant way that we have been asked to help with the climate crisis ever since. This has been the model, this sort of individualistic consumer model. So we've got your light bulbs, we've got your bring your own reusable bags to the grocery store, we've got your make sure to use reusable diapers when you have a baby. I have had two babies and I spent hours doing this whole reusable diaper thing. I felt pretty good about it, but it definitely was a big time suck. And then of course you can't dry your reusable diapers in the dryer. You have to hang them out on the line so that you're not using energy to dry them. And really, you should be using a bike to commute rather than one of those horrible cars that you should feel really guilty about every time you get in. And you need a lot of gear for this bike. So you're starting to see a theme here, which is buying stuff in order to become a better person. And of course, going vegan is a huge way that you can personally change. But it's interesting how that's often been presented to us. It's not so much in recipes or lifestyle changes, but in sort of like stuff you can buy. Now, I gotta say, a lot of this stuff that you can buy is pretty awesome. And I'm a huge fan of this fake meat trend. I love it. I think it's gonna make a big difference. But again, the message that we're getting is, how can I solve climate change? Change how you shop. And it becomes kind of almost like a lifestyle branding thing. You're on Instagram and you see all these sort of renewable, kind of green products that you can buy to be part of the sort of hipster green eco-friendly club. And and of course there's eco-friendly clothes, which actually takes a lot of research to try to find companies that actually are green. And then this leads to this weird kind of hyper green consumerism situation where you can actually become see yourself as a green person by how you shop. And these are a couple of these YouTube videos that kind of show this weird connection between going green and buying. Now, I do not blame these YouTubers at all. This is how we have been trained to respond to the climate crisis, and it's been, actually quite intentional. The big fossil fuel companies that are essentially causing the crisis have intentionally tried to shift the focus on the individual behavior, so that we will be so busy trying to be eco saints that we will not come after them. This has been an active strategy of these fossil fuel companies. So I'm going to give you sort of 5-point plan for how to get out of the shame spiral and the kind of individual consumerist focus on climate change, and how to deal with your climate anxiety. And this is the 5 points here are based on a piece I wrote for the New York Times back in January that I think resonated with a lot of people. So the first step really is just to reject shame. This kind of notion that it's all our fault and we're not shopping correctly is a trap. And the sort of fossil fuel companies want us to be thinking about ourselves only as consumers, not as citizens. And again, it's extremely expensive to zero out your own carbon footprint. It could be like a full-time job. There's some people who have decided to not produce any plastic waste, or to live as green as possible, and like they are spending every day working on this. Is extremely time consuming, and that's because the systems we live in are not set up for it. You have to buy special stuff, you have to make special allowances, you have to work around these poorly designed cities. So all the blame is put on us, and we put all the blame on ourselves, but we're working within a system that makes it almost impossible to be carbon neutral. And I think that it's worth pointing out too that this sort of focus on individual eco virtue can really splinter the sort of climate movement, because not everyone can afford to do all this stuff, either with money or with time. So if you're a single mom, 5 kids, 2 jobs, there's no way that you're going to be able to be carbon neutral. Decide that you're going to bicycle to work every day, and that you're going to cook at home vegan home cooked meals for your 5 children every single day. It's just not it's not realistic. And so what ends up happening is the people who are not able to sort of buy into this green system feel like they can't be part of the environmental movement, and that's a huge loss, because what we're losing are a huge number of people, and some of the people who are going to be most affected by climate change. So one way in which this used to affect us before flying, before coronavirus, was shame, guilt and shame over flying. And this is one that I've thought about a lot, because until recently, I did travel a lot for my job as a reporter. And sort of this flight shame has a name in Sweden, and so there's been all these news articles about, like, maybe people are going to fly less because of this climate shame. But if you look at the data of how many people fly every year, it's just going up and up and up. There are more routes every year. There are more short haul routes, more long haul routes. More people can afford to fly. So this kind of Swedish flight shame, and anybody who decides that they personally are not going to fly, that's great. If that's your choice, I totally respect that. But you're not going to solve the problem by doing that, because you're a tiny drop in this bucket. Instead of trying to use voluntary sacrifice, we're going to have to figure out a way to make flying carbon neutral. Ultimately, that is what we're going to have to do as a society. And we can do it if we put our minds to it, put the incentives in the right place, support basic research at the federal level. It's possible. There's already, sort of early stage research on electric and biofuel, jet fuel. But the thing is, we're just going to have to do that rather than assume that everyone is going to stop flying forever. So this quote from pronounce her name right, Alana Schubach, also speaks to why us all giving up flying forever might not be ideal. Leisure travel is not just something we do for fun. It's something that helps us be more open and less groupist and less xenophobic. So I think ultimately, we don't want to create a world where nobody gets to travel. We want to create a world where you can travel without trashing the planet. So that's just one example of this larger point. Focus on systems rather than yourself. Your individual contribution to climate change is teeny tiny. Unless you're, Jeff Bezos or something, your contribution is very small. And so if you just focus on that, you're just not going to get that much bang for your buck. And also, just everybody perfecting themselves within an unjust system does not address the fundamental injustice of climate, which is that the people who profit off of it are fine, and the people who suffer are not profiting off of it. That is the fundamental problem, injustice, and that's why we talk about climate justice. So, an example from my own life. So, with the Rogue Climate, that group that I showed you before, whose office is just to burn down, I've been helping to fight this pipeline that they want to push through Southern Oregon, through my county and a bunch of adjoining counties, to ship some liquid natural gas overseas to Asia. So we've been fighting this for years. I've marched, I've written op-eds, I actually got arrested at the governor's office fighting this. And I am focusing on this because if we stop this, we will stop 400 million tons of carbon dioxide from going into the atmosphere every year. Now, could I prevent that amount of carbon dioxide from going to the atmosphere by living a perfect life? No, I could not. Even if I had a zero emissions for every year that I'm alive until I'm 100, it could come nowhere close to the amount that I could stop by stopping this project. So just on sort of math basis, I have chosen to put my energy into stopping this project. And so, for example, that meant that when I went to the governor's office in Salem to protest and to ultimately get hauled off to jail, I drove there in my gasoline car because I can't afford an electric car yet. And did I feel guilty about that? No, I did not. Because if we had the right systems 10 years ago, then I would already have an electric car. So here are some of the people that I'm working with. And another point about this that I'm going to talk about in a moment is how many people I've met and how much human connection I have made fighting this pipeline. This is sort of the coalition of people in my town, my small town, that have been fighting it. We have ranchers who don't want their land taken. We have local greenies who work at the local university. We have tribal members who don't want it going through their tribal lands. And many of these people I never would have met or become close to without this fight. So it's also giving me a totally enhanced sense of community. So that's why I recommend joining a collective rather than working on your own. I think working with some people that you can work with in person eventually is a good thing for our mental health because you can make friends. I have a lot of friends now who are in their 20s and I'm 41. So I think that I probably wouldn't have these cool young friends if I wasn't working to stop the pipeline. Now, I want to add another thing here in the last bullet point, which is the idea about making change through your day job. And many of us have day jobs that are pretty all-consuming. So if you're, if you have the time to go join a group that's focused on climate justice, then and commit to some small level of involvement, then that's super awesome. And I recommend doing that because I found it really personally satisfying. But if you just do not have the time to do that, then you're going to want to look for ways that you can fight for climate justice through your day job. And I think you should think pretty broadly about what that means because a lot of these fights are all intertwined. So if you're fighting for justice for any kind of group that is underrepresented, including animals, then I think that you're really fighting for a world in which power is more equally shared. And I think fundamentally, when power is more equally shared and when the rights of animals are included in decision making, we're not going to make these dumb decisions that warm up the climate. Just because the people who are harmed and the animals who are harmed, they're going to be they're going to be at the table. So those decisions won't get made. So if you're fighting for social justice, animal justice, then in some ways you really are fighting for climate justice, because you're fighting for a rethink of who gets to make the decisions and on what basis those decisions are made. If we had really true representation of the interests of wild animals at the table, do you think we would be, voting for fossil fuel pipelines running through wildfire-prone forests? I don't think so. So, conceptualize this broadly. And it may be that you're already doing a ton and you already are making that world that we want to see. So either at your job or in this group that you join, I talk to a lot of people, especially sort of people who are new to this and are freaking out and want to join about what they can do. And I think division of labor is a wonderful thing, and you don't have to know everything about climate policy or atmospheric science or international treaty negotiations or whatever. You can take whatever your expertise is and bring that to the table. So if you are able to spend some time with the climate organization and you have legal skills, that's what they're going to want from you. They're not going to want you to be you're not going to have to spend time photocopying things, or you got to do what you're already good at and what you enjoy doing. And then this last point I think is really super important. So if you're going to be adding something to your plate as far as climate work, make sure that you are modest about your time and energy investments initially. Really be conservative about how much you can give. And if anybody has worked with nonprofits, you know that having people who give monthly is just so much better and more reliable, and kind of helps the organization plan. Even if they're giving $5 monthly, that's ultimately better for the organization than if they just give the $100 once. So the same thing applies to your energy and your time. If you can give, a little bit of time and energy or money every month, that is going to be a lot more useful to the organization than if you come in big and you try to do everything, you try to change the world, and then you burn out and you disappear. So keep it low key. And then this is the last point, and I think, it's one that I think about a lot as a writer, and that is to know what you're fighting for. So a lot of us, I think, spend so much time thinking about what we're fighting against. We have these kind of apocalyptic visions in our head, and those can be very motivating, and they can be very, they can definitely, but they can also just give us anxiety. So knowing what you're fighting for is really important, and having a positive vision of what success looks like. So I've done that in a couple of pieces where I've had the luxury of actually getting paid to sort of imagine good futures, like, what does our agriculture look like? What are we all eating? What are we doing on the weekends? Are we taking buses to go to trailheads to go hiking? Are there trains into the wilderness? Are we all eating lab meat? What does this cool future look like? And envisioning that just really concretely, like, imagine yourself waking up in 2050 when we've made some good decisions. What does that look like? What's your morning routine? And just little things. Like, I imagine the day when I go to the grocery store to buy coffee and I don't have to sit there and read bags for 15 minutes trying to find coffee that isn't killing the birds and isn't, that's shade grown and fair trade and all those labels. That, like, we have made it such that all of the coffee on the shelves is fair trade and is good for the birds and is shade grown. And so I just pick the one that I like the best. Like, that's the kind of future that I always imagine is where the easiest choice is the greenest choice. But when you're imagining this future, I think it's important to sort of think broadly and to kind of realize that it's going to be different than what we have today, and it's going to be different than what we had in the past. Now, some of those changes are, we don't want to go back to the past in terms of things like sexism and racism and how we've been treating animals, right? Like, that past is not one that we feel like we want to aim for. But sometimes we do get caught up in this idea of going back to ecologically to the past, and that's not going to happen either. Like, there's going to be plants and animals that are moving around. Climate change has already happened. The temperature's already gone up. So there's going to be ecological reshuffling. And I write about this a lot. I write about, are we still going to be talking about invasive and native species in 50 years? Or will those movements, as ecosystems kind of adapt to these changed conditions, will those movements be seen as sort of positive adaptive changes or impurity? In general, I'm really skeptical of any kind of hyper purist takes when it comes to the environment, because first of all, if you're really purist about what counts as nature, what counts as wilderness, you're not going to get that, because things are going to change, and so you're going to be disappointed. And second of all, I just don't think it's a really good fit for how the environment works. I mean, what makes ecology so amazing and so complicated and so fascinating is that it's always changing. It's super dynamic. There's evolution, and there's migrations, and there's movements. And one thing that I learned recently doing work in Australia, is that the ecosystems aren't just like these little TikTok machines, right? Like, they're filled with all these sentient actors who are making decisions every day about what they're doing and where they're going and how they're going to act. And so they're really dynamic places filled with agents. They have a history, they have a past, and they're going to have a future. And I think letting there be some autonomy there, letting the non-human agents out in nature, whatever you want to call nature, it's kind of a contested word, but letting those non-human agents kind of sort themselves out to a certain extent is something we want to consider, more than just trying to shove everything back to the way it used to be. That's a kind of a philosophical discussion that we can have maybe in the question and answers, but that's something that I think about a lot, about imagining a good future that doesn't look like the past. And I think technology is going to be a part of getting there for sure. Green energy technologies, new agricultural technologies. In order to basically make more space for non-humans, we're just going to have to use our human brains to figure out ways to live more lightly. And some of that might be pulling back on destructive technologies, which is a more traditional environmental take. But some of that might also be using new non-destructive technologies. So I don't, I try not to reject something just because it's technological. I think we're going to need some of those technologies. So E.O. Wilson came out with a book a few years ago called Half Earth, where he talked about setting aside half of the planet for sort of non-human use. And I thought this was a pretty inspiring vision, and a lot of different people have gotten behind this. But when he first wrote about this illustration that you see on the screen here was what came out to illustrate it. And this, I think, is a little bit of a troubling idea, this idea that we're going to set aside half of the earth for non-humans, but we're not going to interact with that half, that there's going to be kind of a wall between them. And if you read the book, there's definitely hints of that in the book as well. He talks about there being very limited access to these non-human places, and there being webcams so that people can enjoy the non-human world virtually. I think as the pandemic has gone on, I think we've all experienced firsthand the limits of kind of virtual enjoyment. I don't think this is really where we need to be going. I think we need a much more interdigitated, much more interwoven kind of relationship with the non-human world. So I do think that there should be some very large protected areas, big areas where non-humans basically run the show and we just come in to visit. But I also think that we really need to work hard to make sure that there's biodiversity and that there's non-human life in our cities and in the areas that we are living and working every day, in part because we need that for our mental health. And this is sort of important for us as humans. If we don't have a good relationship with other species, I think our souls kind of die a little bit. So instead of separating humans and all the other species, I think that we need to repair our relationships and create new good relationships with other species in a much more swirled up kind of way. So in one of these articles that I was able to write, where I talked a lot about, what a good future would look like, my brother, who's an artist, he's actually a sign installer professionally, but he's an artist for fun. And he drew this awesome picture of his vision of sort of what a good future would look like. So you've got, your cool wildlife overpasses, you've got your kind of more high intensity agricultural, very technological agricultural farms outside of the city. But then you also have little small scale agriculture inside the city so that people can participate in growing their own food and have that connection to it. And then you just have these trees. He lives in Seattle, so pretty sure these are Doug firs, right? Like just growing right into the city. And I think this vision is one, I've got this tacked up in my office, and I think about this a lot. Like, this is a good vision for me. This is one that I feel like we could work for. And yours might be a little bit different, but I think having that is so, because this is achievable. It might not be tomorrow, and it's going to take a lot of work, but something like this is achievable, and we need to remind ourselves that. So I'm just going to finish with a sort of self-therapeutic exercise that I did a few weeks back when I was thinking about all of my intense emotions around climate change. And I decided to kind of draw them out with my kids' markers. And if you don't have kids' markers lying around, I really recommend getting some markers, because I find that drawing with color can be very therapeutic. Anyhow, so I decided to sort of graphically express how I was feeling. And this is what I came up with. I've got this big sort of sea of all of these scared and anxious and uncertain emotions. And I also have this big, deep well of love for the non-human world and for the human world, for all of us. And so out of this kind of mash of emotions, the two main kind of feelings that I often grapple with on a day-to-day basis is anger. And I'm feeling a lot of anger right now with the smoke and the fires and just thinking about all of the suffering that has been caused. But then I also have this hope, and I hold on to that hope. And hope doesn't mean blind optimism, and it doesn't mean that you just assume things will work out for the best. It means that you look for that path forward that is still walkable, realistically walkable. And when you can bring that anger together, that anger gives me a lot of fuel. And then the hope gives me sort of a focus and a directionality for that fuel. And together, I guess what I end up with is determination. I hope that I keep holding on to that. Some days the anger burns everything else up, and some days everything sinks into the sea of sorrow. But overall, by trying to do some little thing to help things every week or every month, and by doing that consistently, and by forming relationships with others who are also worried about the climate and working with them, I have felt a lot more determined and a lot less despairing. And so that's my tips for dealing with climate anxiety. And I think that in particular, for anyone who works on behalf of animals, I think, just keeping in mind that your work is not unrelated, that you don't have to also go out and do climate work separately if you don't really have the bandwidth for it, because what you're doing is already part of the solution. Changing the way our society conceives of non-humans and their rights is going to change how we manage our ecosystems and how we manage our climate, because the people who suffer are human people, and they're animal people as well. And once we start counting them, it's going to be even more impossible to keep doing this to the climate. So thanks so much, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, it looks like we've actually been having a great discussion in the questions. So, and we have a few that are related, going back to the consumerism point that you made near the beginning. So I think we'll start off with those. One is a comment, but then we also have a couple of questions kind of going off of that same idea. I think it takes personal accountability in order to influence the industry through supply and demand. If people continue to buy meat, dairy, etc., the industry will continue to exist and wreak environmental havoc. If people still buy the non-fair trade, shade-grown, etc. coffee, companies will continue to make it. And then kind of the questions going off of that, I totally take your point that capitalism, more consumerism, is not the answer to human overconsumption, which is how we got in this mess in the first place. But conscious consumerism can affect real change. For example, buying fur is no longer fashionable. Can you comment on the role of conscious consumerism in the movement? And then just somebody else's question, kind of sort of rephrasing that, are there specific issues with advocating for conscious consumerism to reduce the demand for products that promote environmental destruction and harm to animals?
So I take all these points, and I think that, for example, let's take the example of the sort of fake meats that have come on the market recently. People going out and buying those, going and get a fake hamburger at Burger King did show the market that there was a demand for those products, and probably that was a really helpful thing. But I don't think we can get where we want to get with purely market-driven pushes and pulls, when we only use our power as consumers to influence these industries. Let's take the other example, the one of shade-grown coffee. It's usually $2 more expensive per bag than a sort of house brand grocery store coffee, at least. And some of us have the ability to pay for that, and we will pay for that. And that sends a signal to the market, and they provide that as an option. But most people buy on price, and that has not changed in 50 years. Most people will buy the cheapest alternative. And that's not because they don't care about birds, it's because that's what they need to do in order to survive. And so we are never going to eliminate non-shade grown coffee by market forces alone. The way to eliminate kind of environmentally destructive coffee would be to make it illegal, to use regulation. So I think there really needs to be a combination of these market signals with really strong regulatory boundaries over what an industry can do. And what I see as a sort of the ideal world is the world in which consumers do not have to send signals from below in order to make these changes, because we have sent those signals through legislation and through our representative democracy, and those kinds of options are just no longer available on the shelves, right? So we don't have to be good in order to buy the right things. All of the things on the shelves are sort of environmentally sustainable. So that's where I really want us to get. And in general, I have got absolutely nothing against people who want to buy and are able to buy the sort of more eco-friendly option. I do it myself, when I can. Like I said in the talk, I don't have the electric car yet. That's coming, hopefully, as soon as my current Subaru kicks the bucket. But if you have, for example, let's say, everyone has a sort of a fixed amount of time and money that they can sort of spend. And what I worry about is I see lots of people who spend all of their time and money on this consumer end stuff, on sort of making sure they have the right cloth bags to go to the grocery store, or offsetting their flights, or what have you. And they spend almost no time on the system change part of the equation. So I think that that's just a misallocation of their own individual resources. I think they just get more, if we all spent a little less time on the consumer stuff and a little more time on the structural stuff, I think we'd get better results. But that doesn't mean you can't do the consumer stuff. I think of it as almost like icing on the cake.
Okay. So let's see. Nikki asks, keeping in the scope of the climate crisis in mind, and that the blame primarily rests with fossil fuel industry, corporations, and government, do you believe that going vegan for those who are privileged enough to participate, either part or full time, is the largest singular action an individual can take, which simultaneously sends a message to the animal ag industry?
Probably, if you're looking, when you say largest action, if you're measuring that through avoided emissions, I mean, I think that the math suggests that might in fact be more powerful than, for example, it depends on what you're doing now, right? Like if your baseline is you fly to Singapore once a month, then maybe cutting those flights out would be more emissions than going vegan. But I think going vegan is among the highest emission canceling actions that a person can take. And usually, if I give people my argument for why they should be focusing more on systemic change, and changing sort of big rules, auto standards and so on, like the new rules in California, that's the kind of stuff that's really going to get us where we need to go. And they say, but I want to do something personal. I usually do suggest a dietary change, either cutting out beef to start or cutting out all meat. So yeah, I think it can make a difference. Now, the market signal stuff I think is also interesting, because I spend a decent amount of time looking at what data exists about sort of how many people are vegan, or how many people, one pattern that's been really interesting to me is I think a lot of the demand for these meat substitutes is actually coming from people who aren't vegan, and vegans still represent a really pretty small percentage of US consumers. The data I've seen is mostly for the US. And probably still at this point, not enough to really drive big agribusiness trends. However, people who do eat meat, but then want to eat less of it, are actually pretty numerous. It's this sort of reducitarian faction, I think, that at the moment has the attention of the sort of big agribusiness companies in the world. And I find that really interesting. And in some ways, it's kind of goes along with my point about not trying to be a perfect eco-citizen, that there's still a lot of benefit for people who are reducing their meat consumption. That's still pushing the market in interesting ways.
And we have a couple of questions that are similar, kind of about talking with others about this issue. The first one, I work with fairly young legal interns, and they all show signs of eco-anxiety. Do you have any tips on how to approach this issue in a constructive and compassionate way with them?
Yeah, I mean, I find that these conversations that are intergenerational can be really hard, because there's a sense that I definitely feel myself that we have actually let these younger generations down by not doing more ourselves. So I sort of get this, I have this kind of constant baseline guilt about my own personal contributions to climate change. And then I have now this sort of generational guilt about my sort of Generation X failing to really solve this in any meaningful way. So I think that can be something that's tricky when you're talking to people who are in different generations than you. They might even, at some psychological level, feel a sense, a little bit of a grudge against their elders for not sorting this out. So I think that's something to really be cognizant of when you have conversations like that, whether it was a big age dynamic. And then I think, there's a lot of sort of talking through the ideas about sort of the justice framing here. So who are the sort of bad guys, and who are ultimately, as everybody contributes to climate change, but we are also victims of climate change in a way, because we are already feeling the effects. So this summer, my children had to stay inside for 2 weeks because of smoke levels. And so they were essentially being punished for emissions that were put out in the air before they were born. So the sort of the blameworthiness and also who is the victim here are complicated, and they're usually in some level the same people. So sorting that out can be really difficult, but I think the key is to really focus on trying to help those who are going to be the most hurt by climate change, rather than punishing yourself for being somewhere way down on the list, in the list of people who contributed. Because as I said in the talk, our contributions are real, but they were also very difficult to avoid because of the systems that we find ourselves in. So attempting to change those systems alleviates for myself a lot of that guilt.
The other one, kind of along those lines of communicating, any suggestions for communicating effectively with family members, other close people in your life who don't see the value in climate or wildlife protection?
Yeah, so communication is sort of my thing. And so I've thought a lot about this. And I think that one thing that actually goes along with that earlier conversation about sort of individual action versus collective action is that I think that the focus on individual action also created a certain amount of resistance to these messages, because the perception is that if you sort of buy into the notion that climate change is real, or that species are going extinct and that something needs to be done, then the perception is that will then require you to sacrifice a lot personally and to sort of live a smaller life. In fact, we just saw this yesterday in the debate when Donald Trump was talking about smaller windows, us all having to put up with smaller windows because of climate change. So there's this framing as if there's going to be privation, and also people feel attacked. They feel like you're blaming them for not doing better. So I think that when you talk to people who don't seem to prioritize these issues in their lives, it's good to steer away from stuff like, well, how much do you fly, or how much beef are you eating, as your entry point, because then that's going to give them that defensive reaction right away. And to really maybe focus on the ways in which they have been hurt by these environmental policies. Well, how was your trip to Yellowstone completely derailed by wildfire smoke? Or what about, did you lose, something in hurricanes? Or have you had seeing increases in your heating or cooling bill? Those kinds of things. And to get them to maybe think about ways in which the climate is already negatively affecting them on the victim side, rather than focusing on how that they are part of the problem. And then, I think that in some ways, maybe psychologically not so surprising, people are more likely to rally around a cause where they feel like that they can fight for justice rather than they have to be better people themselves. So I think the justice framing is helpful for that, showing how people are hurt, especially defenseless people or people who are already suffering a lot.
Okay. Um, yeah, here's a question about kind of what should we do? How can we change the practices of the fossil fuel industry, animal agricultural industry, and the government when these systems have so much political and financial influence from certain groups, lobbyists, and ranchers? How can we realistically get bills passed by Congress that have economic incentives for these systems to change their environmentally damaging ways?
So this is where you need to have, this is why I talk a lot about setting a realistically sustainable level of commitment to these fights, right? Because they are not short. This is not going to be something that we wake up tomorrow and Joe Biden wins the presidency and he fixes everything and everything is great. Like these are all going to be extremely long term and incremental fights with a lot of incremental progress along the way. So this pipeline that I'm fighting in my own neck of the woods, if we get that shut down, then that's great. But that doesn't mean that there's no more fossil fuels in Oregon. So then we're going to move on to the next fight, And the same with the agriculture. So maybe you are able to get some sort of ordinances around manure lagoons going, and that feels great. That feels good. And then the next thing is maybe you're able to put some pressure on your representatives to reduce some subsidies for the beef industry. And maybe those subsidies come down and maybe we see, fewer head of cattle out on the land. But it's not going to be like overnight. It's never going to be overnight. And that's really, we're just going to have to realize that this is going to be a probably decades, lifetime kind of fight. And it's always about trying to make things better every incremental step along the way. But I am hopeful that we can, get things better along the way. We've seen examples of those, and sometimes we tend to forget our successes because they become the normal background. Somebody pointed out yesterday that if you add up the ages of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, that was before women had the right to vote. So when progress does occur, we get used to it real quick, and then we think, oh, nothing ever gets better. But things do get better, and they can get better, and it's just going to take a lot of collective fighting over the long term, and some of it's really strategic and bureaucratic and boring. And like I've spent a lot of time commenting on environmental impact statements and filing my documents with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And it's not always that glamorous, but it's just that it takes consistent effort.
And that kind of raises a question in my mind. So many of us work full time, and a lot of people have kids and other responsibilities, especially now that everybody's at home. And how do you find the time to do this?
Yeah, so I squeeze in probably a little more than I would expect other people to do, because it's my journalistic beat. It's what I think about all day. So I kind of do more probably than I feel like people should feel like they have to do. But I just think about some of the stuff that we do. Like, for example, let's say you are, just as a hypothetical, let's say you are taking the bus to work to reduce your climate impacts of driving. And let's say taking the bus takes an extra 45 minutes per day. Well, let's say that then once a month, you drive instead, so that you can go to your meeting of the local climate change action. That seems like a good trade-off, taking a little bit of time out of that individual goodness pot and putting it in the collective pot. So sometimes when I'm going to go testify before city council, my kids get a frozen pizza for dinner. And I don't feel guilty about that. So you gotta, you can't be perfect in all aspects of your life. I have sometimes been frustrated when I'm trying to rally my friends to come to some protests and they say they can't, but they sort of somehow magically have time to make yogurt in their Instant Pots from scratch. And I'm like, how, just buy the soy gurt and come on out. So it's a priorities thing. But again, I do say, you don't have to become a full-time climate activist. It could be that you say, I'm gonna give 1 hour per week consistently. And that, I think, would be enough. If everybody gave 1 hour per week, we'd be in great shape.
And kind of another balancing question that comes to mind, because I am guilty of this. I, so often, I feel the need that I want all the information I can get about what's going on with climate change and what's going on with animal welfare issues. I feel like I need that information so that I can make these changes and do these things. That if I don't know about them, I won't change. But at the same time, I listen to the news and end up like yelling at the radio just at the stories. So where's the balance in kind of getting the information, but also needing just kind of that peace and quiet?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a huge point. I mean, I still spend more time than I need to marinating in the bad news, and I think a lot of us do that. We're doom scrolling on our phones. We're watching cable news. We go, it only really takes 15, 20 minutes to get the update of the news, but then we kind of marinate in it a little bit because we're horrified, and and it becomes a weirdly compulsive process. So I do try to kind of cut myself off and do something, go write a letter to the editor in my local newspaper rather than just having the input, right? So I try to balance input and output. If reading the news all day long about all the horrors of the world is just constant input, well, I got to balance that with something I'm doing to try to make the world better, and that's the output. So if I find that I'm just all input and no output, I try to cut myself off and switch that ratio a little bit. But another thing I do is I sort of decide to check out of certain like elections or races that. So in this last election cycle, I live in Oregon, which always goes Democratic. So I decided not to pay any attention to the federal level stuff, other than just what comes across my doom feed, and to completely focus on Klamath County, where I live. And I've been working, I've been volunteering for the campaign for state representative there. I helped organize a billboard for the local Democrats. And I've been focusing on a scale where I can actually make a difference. And then I've been allowing myself to just like not pay any attention to the presidential race. And it has saved my bacon.
Sanity. One person asks, you have mentioned blame quite a few times. Do you see that as a useful emotion or more of a necessary evil?
Well, I think that holding the people who have really made a lot of money off of the climate crisis to account is going to be part of the process of getting justice and also of us all emotionally healing. And you know what? That's not us. I mean, we have benefited in small ways, like cheap gas and things like that, being able to take a road trip. But we have not become millionaires off of destroying that, heating up the atmosphere. And I think those people who knew about what they were doing and have known for decades should face some sort of accountability. And I think that is going to be part of the process of getting justice. I think the justice framing has been useful for me. Maybe it wouldn't be useful for everybody. I used to think of climate change much more as just this scientific puzzle, that if people just knew the science and then we had the solutions, that people would just say, oh, yes, let's do that. But there was a naivete there that people wouldn't take advantage of the situation to profit. And that is what we have to address, is the fact that there are not the correct incentives to solve the problem.
Okay, it looks like I'm getting a signal that we have time for one or two more questions, but we actually don't have any more questions. So if anybody has one last question, quick, now is your chance.
I see one here about the Supreme Court nominee not forming an opinion on climate change. I mean, I think that this is I'll just say briefly that I think that this kind of this I don't have an opinion has been the Republican line now, or the conservative line, for quite a few years, since the science has become so irrefutable. The only way they can maintain this fiction is by saying that somehow they haven't looked into the question. And so everybody predicted that they would go from climate change denial to climate change minimization. And I think that we're seeing that. And then the next step is saying, well, it's too late to do anything about it, which we've already seen the beginnings of. So ultimately, I think the easier way to deal with the people who are that firmly in the pocket of being willing to torch the atmosphere for profit is to just get them out of power, rather than try to convince them.
And there are a couple of comments I will read kind of in wrap up. Karen says, I love your recommendations of good relationships with other humans and other species and your incorporation of art. Thank you for normalizing quiet anxiety, anger, sorrow, and hope. Small, consistent efforts matter.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you so much for your informative talk and your thoughtful answer to my question.
There's the comment here from Gabrielle Reisner is a good one too, that there's a lot of privilege that's involved when you can afford to be the eco-friendly option. And I think it's all worth our looking at that in ourselves. I remember I once interviewed an organic farmer that said that single mothers in poverty would be able to feed their children much better if they just made soup at home from scratch. And I was like, time is money. So I think that's a real thing. And that's why I think getting away from the consumer focus also helps us make better allies with people, folks in poverty, immigrants, other communities that are really hurt by climate change.
Great. Okay, I am going to read one last one, and then I am going to wrap up. Lindsay says, thank you for all you shared. This was so thought-provoking and inspiring.